Greetings, everyone. So happy to have you back. I'm Justin Jacobs, Professor of History at American University, and we continue with our march through the Compensations of Plunder, How China Lost Its Treasures. We just finished talking about the chapter 4, The Priceless Nation. Now we're going to move on to Chapter 5, The Rise of the Apprentices. And what we're seeing here, what we're going to be talking about are two major expeditions that really sort of are the backdrop for how the game has really changed in the 1920s. We are now firmly in the age of obstruction, not sort of the opportunistic obstruction that we saw with Governor Yang, in which he's not a true believer in the new ideals of cultural sovereignty in the Chinese nation. He's just invoking these ideals cynically to benefit himself. What we're talking about now are the rise of people who are true believers in the Western ideals, that these are priceless artifacts that are emblems of your nation. Therefore, political legitimacy of your leaders is based upon protecting and preserving these within the borders of your country. And anyone who removes them, Westerner, Chinese, whatever, is a thief, is betraying the nation if they take that abroad. That very new idea, now it's finally coming of age. We have all the elements in place for the obstruction of Western archaeological expeditions, with one crucial caveat in the case of China that we do not see in the successor states of the Ottoman Empire, places like Turkey, places like Egypt. What do we see in China that we don't necessarily see, at least not to the same degree, in the Ottoman successor states? That is political instability in China. Well, you could always point to political instability. It's a matter of degree. All right. China, throughout the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, is riven by either civil war, the presence of autonomous warlords, or foreign invasion, and sometimes all three at once. Okay. So what happens here is that you've got all three of your elements in place. You've got your antiquities export laws, prohibition of export laws. You've got your national museums, and you also have your fully westernized domestic elites who have been educated oftentimes abroad, but even if not abroad, they've been educated in a Western mode, and they've been raised to believe that these artifacts have the exact same valuation that the Westerners put on them. That is, priceless emblems of the nation. What we're going to see in China, though, is that there's no possibility of a united front, because you have so much political instability, so much local autonomy, so much warfare. In other words, although the ideals are in place now, you don't necessarily have the conditions that are going to allow those ideals to be implemented to the fullest extent. Okay, so there's still going to be some room for Westerners to kind of try and get what they want, to a degree that perhaps we won't see in Egypt, where Howard Carter is pretty much fully obstructed, and there's not a whole lot that he can do about it, unless he concedes to what the Egyptians want him to do with regard to King Tut's tomb in 1923 and 1924. So this is our question for today, how do westernized Chinese scholars of the 1920s pursue obstruction of Western archaeological expeditions in their country when their own rulers keep engaging the compensations of cooperation? All right, and the answer is going to be they're going to send out apprentices, what I refer to as apprentices in this chapter, to the Western archaeological expeditions that they're still allowing to go into the field because there's no united front to keep them from going into the field. You might, if you really want to, you can think of these guys maybe as spies, although as we'll talk about today, Chun Wanli, who you're seeing here on the left in the second Fog expedition, probably not a spy, although those who accompany Sven Hedin on the Sino-Swedish expedition just a few years later, they are not really spies, but spying, keeping tabs on the foreigners is one of their tasks that they are going to engage in, even though their primary task is still scientific research. And then finally, media pressure. That's going to be sort of the ultimate trump card that the nationalist domestic elites of any country, really, who wants to obstruct Western archaeologists but find that their leaders are still more interested in political capital, diplomatic capital, economic capital, whatever it might be. You can try to shame your leaders through negative media attention to tarnish their political legitimacy and say, hey, these politicians, in not doing more to prevent Westerners from removing our priceless emblems of the nation, they aren't really protecting our nation, and they don't deserve to be the president, the prime minister, the king, whatever, because they're really betraying our nation. So you can use negative media pressure, and we're going to see that tactic in evidence quite a lot as well, especially with Sven Hedin and with Oral Stein. Okay, so the second fog expedition, here we're seeing Langdon Warner, probably a little bit younger, maybe 1910s, early 1920s, before he's actually going to go out on his two expeditions to Dunhuang in 1923 to 24, and then another one in 1925. And then we have Chen Wanli here on the left. Not as many images and photographs that I can sort of use to illustrate today's talk. There isn't a whole lot of documentation for what happens on this expedition. It's very difficult to reconstruct, and as a result, because it turned into such a fiasco, we don't actually have a whole lot of photographs and images that are easily accessible either, but we'll do what we can to sort of bring this alive even more than what we have in the book itself. Okay, so let us start off by considering the suggestion of Edward Forbes. Edward Forbes, the director of the Fogg Museum at Harvard, that's the institutional sponsor of these of the expeditions that Langdon Warner is embarking on. Consider his suggestion before the second expedition goes out, which we open up this chapter with. Edward Forbes suggests that perhaps the expeditions should hire a Russian artist who could repaint the caves they want to remove. Remember, this time they're saying, hey, we saw the White Russian depredation. We saw that these caves are deteriorating. The Chinese, Wang Yuanlu's efforts notwithstanding, it's not up to the standards of the Westerners. They're saying that these caves are, the end is near. We need to rescue them. So, but they also recognize, note in this suggestion that where he's at, they're not just saying, let's go and take these, no one cares about them. They know that this is a site of active religious worship. That is to say, there's a perception of cultural continuity with the locals who view it as priceless. This is one of the only other ways that the domestic actors can view these things as priceless in the age before nationalism, is that they see it precisely as a site of active religious worship. And if you damage it, if you don't protect it, the gods can be angry at you. It's a very different form of obstruction than we're talking about in our class, but nevertheless, it is a form of obstruction that we want to note because the distinction is very important. Boy, my dog's really barking up a storm upstairs. In a minute, he's probably going to come down and, oh, here we go. You're going to have to take a minute for me to put him in his crate and shut him up. All right, so he recognizes that there could be some opposition to this. Okay, Edward Forbes realizes this in advance. We need to leave the locals with something that they will be satisfied with, because he knows they actively worship these, despite the deterioration, despite putting the White Russians in there, and they were allowed to vandalize the caves. Everyone knows going into this that they're kind of going into uncharted territory here. They're kind of playing with fire. In saying we're going to repaint caves that we remove. Now, also note how this is kind of similar to what Wang Yuanlu was doing. Think about this. We're trying to think about, interesting comparisons and parallels. What was Wang Yuanlu doing? He was begging for all this money, trying to sell the Dunhuang manuscripts for what? To restore the caves, to paint them, to redo the painting with a modern day artist. And in his eyes, that seemed like it was totally fine. He's not valorizing 1,000-year-old paintings that are flaking off the wall and you can barely tell what Buddhist or Taoist deity it's even supposed to be anymore. He's saying, no, what matters is that it's beautiful and complete and new and that we pay attention to it and the gods are pleased that we are continually updating the site. No valorization of antiquity for antiquity's sake. And so somehow Edward Forbes and the members of the Second Fog expedition are also thinking that this is going to be enough. All we need to do is, as long as we replace the caves with modern day replicas, that'll be good enough. Okay, that will be good enough for the locals because they don't care if it's the real historical painting or, they just want to see that this is the Buddhist deity and I can worship and make offerings to the Buddhist deity. There's some interesting parallels here with the restoration that Wang Yuanlu was doing, even though most outsiders, Chinese and Westerners alike, were pretty quick to denigrate Wang's restorations and say, oh, how vulgar, this is really bad stuff. He doesn't appreciate the original historical stuff. Well, Edward Forbes had a very similar idea at the exact same time, although I guess it is still a little different because he wants to remove the originals and still preserve them, albeit in America. All right, now let's talk about some of the actual events of the Second Fog expedition. As I said before, and as I talk about in this chapter, it turned into a fiasco for Warner, and he was pretty humiliated and embarrassed by how it all happened. So it's disputed. It's hard to recover the events of what actually happened. Warner himself later on went out of his way to publicly sort of, whitewash the record, exaggerate things. He outright lied sometimes to try to cover up his culpability for the failure of the expedition. So we have to use several different sources. Okay, we have to use several different sources, and even then, we don't have a crystal clear view of what happened, but we're going to get a better idea than what previous generations of scholarship have thought happened here. So our best available sources are Horace Jane. Remember, Langdon Warner actually is remaining behind in Beijing for the majority of this expedition because he's trying to liaison with Chinese officials in Beijing to see if they can set up a joint Chinese-American School of Archaeology, and then eventually he was going to catch up with the expedition and try to meet them by the time that they got to Dunhuang. As it turns out, he gets there right as the party is being obstructed in Dunhuang, and he himself does not set foot in Dunhuang in 1925 on this second expedition. It's Horace Jane. And unfortunately, I can't find a picture of Horace Jane. I really can't. There is another famous Horace Jane, who is a different guy that you'll find online. That is not our Horace Jane. Horace Jane was curator at the Pennsylvania Museum of Art, once a colleague of Warner. They kept in touch. And he ends up being the de facto American leader of this expedition in 1925, while waiting for Warner to catch up with the party. And then you have Chen Wanli. This is the only picture I have of him, at least at this age. This is the picture that he includes in his own published diary. He is a professor of medicine at Peking University, also has expertise in Chinese philosophy. He is versed in classical Chinese scholarship, but he is also, I would refer to him as westernized. All right, he's westernized. You can see him here as well. He also looks very different. He's dressing like the Westerners do. These are expedition clothing from the 1920s. You've got the glasses and whatnot. I mean, he has a little bit of facility in foreign non-Chinese languages. So I would think of him as the first westernized Chinese who is going to go out into the field of archaeology. All right, now, was Chen a spy, as Warner later alleged? Well, we can't know entirely 100% for sure because we only have Chen's published diary. It would be great if we had his unpublished diary, because of course when people publish things, they begin to censor it and change things. And it's entirely possible that certain things in Chen's diary were massaged later on to conform to political sensitivities. But all available evidence, Chen's published diary, Jane's unpublished letters, which thank goodness we do have unpublished English language letters from several members of the expeditions. Jane's are the most important, back to Edward Forbes in Harvard, telling him what's going on. And you got to imagine when Jane, the de facto leader of the expedition, is telling Edward Forbes, the main sponsor of the expedition back in America, what happened, why we're failing, he's going to be pretty honest in his unpublished correspondence, different than you might find when they're speaking to a public audience who might judge them in a different way. What evidence do we have that Chen is probably not a spy so far? Well, we have many different unpublished letters from the Americans saying that he's great, praising him, saying he's an asset to the expedition. We even have some very explicitly saying we don't think that he is a spy. Langdon Warner's earlier letters are also much more nice and to Chen Wanli than they later will become. It's only after the expedition fails that he begins to suspect that Chen may have been a spy, but when he first meets him and everything, even Warner himself believed that Chen was not sent as a spy. We also note that it makes no sense to send a spy. It would be redundant. Remember, William Hung and Yuan Fuli, who we saw in the last chapter with the first expedition, they had already alerted local officials all along the route that the Americans were going to take. They had already alerted them. Make sure they don't take anything. Remember, we have multiple secret orders. Dieyou Mi Ling. This is from Chen's diary that he inserts there, published in 1926, the very next year. We learned that all the officials along the route had already been contacted by William Hung and Yuan Fuli to monitor them, make sure they don't take anything, because by this point, they've learned what Warner had done at Dunhuang on the first expedition. Now, the other big evidence that we know that Chen probably was not a spy is what happens at a very understudied, almost forgotten event early on in the expedition. They don't actually even really do any real work at Dunhuang, and when they get there, they end up staying only 3 days. It's very anticlimactic. Where they spend more time and do actual work is at the Arhat Caves in Gansu province. Here you can see, again, I couldn't find, this is a pretty remote part of China, even though it looks like it's in the heartland. Much of Gansu is a very poor, dusty province. So, Beijing is right about here. They're going on the railway sort of down to this point, and then from here, they have to take carts and and various means of very slow transportation to get to Dunhuang, which is going to be right about here. This is Jingchuan County within Gansu province, and this is where the events, the friction occurs at what is known as the Arhat Caves. And Arhat is a type of Buddhist deity. So it's just, there's going to be Buddhist art here. The Arhat Caves, not nearly as magnificent as the caves at the Mogao Grottos at Dunhuang, but nevertheless, caves that are going to have Buddhist art inside. So you can see the comparison with Dunhuang, how the reaction that the Americans and Chen Wanli get from the local people and the local officials at the Arhat Caves in Jingchuan is going to be a wonderful preview of what they were going to find at Dunhuang, even though Dunhuang is what gets all the attention here. So, March 23, 1925, the party arrives at Jingchuan in Gansu and starts trying to remove a bunch of old things. First, Horace Jane, tries to test Chen. He's not really sure if this expedition will be able to take anything because there's some tensions in the air. So he asked Chen, can I remove what he refers to as a loose stone? Alan Priest, I think it was a fine arts tutor from Harvard who was attached to the expedition. Alan Priest says it was an incense pot. Anyways, we've got some sort of an artifact from a temple near the Arhat Caves that Jane is hoping to remove with an eye. He says, maybe we can convince Chen to let us take this by saying that we'll give it to a museum in Beijing later. He's just testing him at this point to see what his attitude's going to be towards the Americans removing stuff from the locality. First, let's see if he'll allow us to take it to Beijing. And then maybe, if he does and that goes well, maybe we'll be able to remove things to America later on. What's Chen's reaction? No. Nothing can be removed, at least not by you. Okay, not by the Americans. But, he says, I'm okay taking it to the local Chinese magistrate of this county. He later regrets this. Note this, okay? He later regrets this. Because what happens? He gives it to the magistrate. And who is the magistrate? Oh, it turns out he's old school. It's not a westernized Chinese official. A young man like himself. The local magistrate is old school Confucian. And he puts it into the private collection of his yamen, the government office. And he gives a promise to Chen. He promises, I'll give this to the local provincial Gansu government later. Chen says, I don't really think that's what's going to happen. It's actually, I have no idea what's going to happen to this incense pot or loose stone or whatever it was. It says once it goes to a non-westernized Chinese elite, it enters his personal private network. It becomes essentially his private property. And he has no idea what's going to happen to him. He says, I have no faith that it's actually going to make its way to a museum in Beijing like the magistrate actually suggested it might. It's going to be treated like those Dunhuang manuscript colophons that we looked at in Chapter 2, Accumulating Culture. It's going to circulate among that official's own private networks in pursuit of political and social capital, and perhaps if he gets desperate enough, economic capital by selling it. Okay, so this actually, Chen we see him in a learning process. His mindset is changing day to day as he finds out himself what the different attitudes of different members of Chinese society are going to be. So then the next day, the whole party visits the Arhat Caves, and they find a foundation stele inscribed with Chinese characters, an old stele from a foundation temple, like commemorating the creation of the foundation that a temple is later going to be built on. Historically, very valuable. Classically educated Chen says, this is important. And now he says, neither the Americans nor the local magistrate should take this. All right, before he just said the Americans can't take it, I'm going to give it to another Chinese. Now he realizes that not all Chinese are like him. He's unique. He's a westernized Chinese who subscribes to Western ideals about the priceless value of this and how it represents the nation and should go into a national museum in Beijing or a national university like Peking University. Okay, but he also can't let the peasants keep it. All right, see how complex Chinese society is here, and he's just sort of realizing this. He doesn't have a whole lot of experience in the field. He says the peasants only utilize this for superstitious purposes. They don't even know what this is. They don't appreciate the historical value of this inscription on the stele. Only I do. So what does Chen then do with regard to this? I can't let the Westerners take it. They value it as priceless, but they're going to move it abroad to America. That's no good. I can't let the Chinese magistrate have it because he's old school and he's not going to see it as priceless and it's going to be seen as his own private property, even if he tells me it's going to go into the government network and eventually make its way to Beijing. No, he doesn't believe that. No way. And he can't let the peasants have it either because they're vulgar, illiterate, stupid peasants who don't appreciate the historical value of it. So what does Chun do? He does exactly what the Westerners are accustomed to doing for many decades. Take without asking. Why? Because he firmly believes in the nobility of his ideological goal. I'm the only one who will take care of this properly. That's what the Westerners have been saying for the past 150 years throughout the world. All right, the locals won't appreciate it; they'll destroy it, or it'll go into private networks and be treated as social or political capital. I'm the only one who properly appreciates this. What does properly mean in this context? It means in accordance with all Western ideals, including it being an emblem of my nation and thus remaining within the borders of my nation as they exist today. Recall Langdon Warner's wife when she hears about the debacle at Dunhuang on the second expedition. She has this ugly comment in which she says that maybe this whole fiasco wouldn't have occurred if the Chinese had acted like white men. Instead, they acted like swine. Ugh. Ugly line, right? She's not part of the expedition. I don't want to pile on to her. She's just seeing what her husband writes back. He's lying through his teeth. We know that Langdon Warner is not a reliable narrator. And so she's, buying his story wholesale. However, note the irony here. The reason you have tension on this expedition is precisely because Chen Wanli and all his colleagues at Peking University in Beijing, Yuan Fuli, he's at Peking University, William Hung, he's at Yenjing University, but still, same circle of like-minded, westernized Chinese elites. It's precisely because Chen Wanli, is acting like a quote-unquote white man, that Warner is obstructed. And it's precisely because Warner's acting like swine that he makes everything so much worse for himself. Right? Note the irony here. The end result of all this is that Chun hides the stele that he finds here in the Arhat caves from the peasants, from everyone. He takes it for himself, doesn't let the magistrate, makes sure the Americans can't get it, and also hides it from the peasants with great trepidation. Because when they have this little, friction over Jane and everyone peeling off the mud off of the wall murals so they can take photographs. Chun Wanli's like, oh my God, I hope they don't find the stele that I put in my cart and sort of put a blanket over it. Because if they do, they're going to treat me just like Warner. Not just like Warner, just like they're treating the Americans. They make no distinction. The peasants would view this as theft, just like the peasants at Dunhuang viewed Warner's taking away of their cave murals as theft in 1924. Fascinating observation here. In the eyes of the peasants, both at Dunhuang and at the Arhat caves in Jingchuan in Gansu province, both the Americans and Chun Wanli are basically foreign imperialists. This is why we can't fall back on these easy ideas about the Chinese nation, the American nation, the French nation. There's no such thing. These are abstract concepts that are invented. And we are raised from birth to believe in them because it's so unnatural to identify in some significant sense with people you've never met before who live 1,000 miles away, of different economic classes, perhaps different religions. It makes no sense for us to believe in that. That's why we, at least when I was a kid, I don't know if they do it anymore. That's why when I was a kid growing up, every single day for 12 years or whatever in school, the day started off with, let's all rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, with liberty and justice for all. Those are great ideals, wonderful. I hope we embody those ideals. But that's political propaganda, brainwashing little kids into believing into the sanctity and the inviolability and the eternalness of a nation, and that you all have something similar in common when really you don't. Right? We're seeing this here. The fault lines are obvious in an expedition like this. There's no such thing as the Chinese nation. There's Chun Wanli and the westernized Chinese elites. They think and act one way. There are the old school, non-westernized Chinese elites, like the local magistrate. They act another way. There are the illiterate poor peasants. They act another way. And they can all have tensions with each other. It's not just China versus Western archaeologists. It's so much more complicated than that. Now, the Arhat Cave scuffle shows Chun's embrace of the Western scientific agenda in every respect except for removal of objects abroad. Because now Chun believes we can do this just as well as you can, perhaps even better, and these have to stay inside the Chinese nation. We have our own museums, our own export prohibition laws, and our own qualified westernized Chinese scholars to study them properly. Right. Note also how this whole incident at the Arhat Caves plays out in the end. The Americans get into trouble with the local peasants when they're scraping crust or crusty mud off of cave murals so they can take photographs. And it gets a little testy. The peasants come in and say, "What are you doing? You're defacing our gods." They've essentially caught him red-handed. What Warner did at Dunhuang the year before and didn't get caught, now the Jane and the Americans, and Chun, he says he participated in it, they get caught in the act. It's a direct parallel to what happened at Dunhuang the year before, but now you get caught, and the peasants are pissed. At Dunhuang, they had to settle for accosting the local Chinese magistrate and say, "Why did you allow Warner to do this? Get those murals back or our gods will be displeased." Here, they catch the perpetrators red-handed. And so they sort of gather around. All the villagers from 6 local villages come in, and they're ready to beat them up. Eventually, Chun has to intervene, and they realize, okay, we're going to have to come up with a settlement here, and they pay 66 American dollars. That's a lot of money to the villagers at that time for the damage that had been done to their gods. What is Chun's reaction here? This is very interesting. It's very instructive. Does he say, "Oh, thank goodness these peasant protectors of the Chinese nation helped me resist the Westerners because the Westerners are trying to steal things from the Chinese nation"? No! He says, "I have remorse for my colleagues. I'm so sorry that they had to go through the terror of having a peasant mob surround them and threaten them with violence." And he even goes further and says, I am convinced that this was the right thing to do. And I participated in it. He wants his audience to know that I participated in the scraping off of mud because it was the proper scientific thing to do so we could take photographs of it and have things that we can study when we go back home for the advancement of scholarship. And then he denigrates the peasants. He doesn't denigrate the Americans. He says, this was the right thing to do. It was their idea, yes, the Americans' idea, but I fully participated. This is what modern day scholars and scientists do. And the peasants are ignorant and stupid, and I'm so sorry that my American colleagues had to undergo this terror. All right, so very, very informative to understand his sympathy with the Americans. As long as they're not removing things from China, they are mere images of each other now. The Western archaeologist and the Westernized Chinese who now subscribe to the Western archaeologist ideals and just want to displace them. Of course, until you actually displace them and there's peace and unity at the land, throughout the Chinese land, you'll try to piggyback on the Westerners to get into the field when you otherwise didn't have the money or the political resources to get into these warlord domains out in the middle of nowhere where things can be actually be quite dangerous. So the rest of the expedition is sort of anticlimactic. Really, the big action is at the Arhat Caves. When they get to Dunhuang, Warner still isn't there. They are immediately informed of what happened the year before, that none of the Americans knew yet. They say, "Hey, after you left, you know what happened?" And this is how we learn about it retroactively, is from Chun's published diary. All right. Now, note the distinction here. The obstruction of Warner, the actual anger of the peasants at Dunhuang was the same anger of the peasants at Jingchuan, at the Arhat Caves. It was not based on cultural sovereignty of the Chinese nation. Absolutely not. It was based on superstitious, illiterate, poor peasants who said, "Hey, what are you doing to my gods? We're going to have drought and famine next year because you have assaulted our gods." That's it. There's nothing that didn't have to occur in the 1920s. If Stein had done the same thing in 1901, he would have had the same reaction. And he probably would have had support of the local Chinese official as well, who said, "These stupid Chinese, these stupid, ignorant peasants, pay no attention to them. Just make sure you don't do things that piss them off, but they don't really understand what our lofty, intellectual ideals are." The real obstruction that occurs on the second expedition is the obstruction of William Hung and Yuan Fuli from Beijing. Them sending out telegrams to all the officials, including those at Dunhuang, that say they can't remove anything. because look what they did on the first expedition. And these are now priceless emblems of the Chinese nation. If they go anywhere, they should be coming to Beijing into a national institution of higher learning. That's where the real obstruction comes from. And Warner conflates all of these things together. Okay? He doesn't want to admit that all this money and all these resources have been wasted because he angered superstitious peasants at Dunhuang. He can't admit that. I was defeated by poor, dirty peasants? No. Right? No. He also, I don't really think he understands about all the secret telegrams going back from William Hong and Yuan Fuli. I really don't think he understands that. He also doesn't realize that Chen Wanli is just someone who's being sent out in the field because the Chinese can't get out there themselves. A warlord's not going to let other Chinese from Beijing come into their jurisdiction by themselves because they're going to see them as an agent of another warlord. So they say, hey, we can piggyback on a Western expedition who can get into the interior of our country. So Warner really doesn't understand what's going on here. How does he find an excuse to absolve himself of all blame? He blames it on the May 30th incident, which is utterly absurd. And he tries to, obscure the timeline of when everything was taking place. And we talk about the May 30th incident in the chapter. I don't have to go over it again, but all we need to know is compare the May 30th incident when it occurs with Chun's diary. Chun's diary is able to refute Warner's version of events and tells us exactly when the Americans were in Dunhuang. The Americans were in Dunhuang, May 18th through the 21st, something like that. It was at least a week and a half before the May 30th incident broke out in Shanghai. The May 30th incident, as its name suggests, took place on May 30th. So there's zero connection between the two events whatsoever. Zero connection. Warner was obstructed at Dunhuang by the peasants because he had desecrated their gods. The expedition as a whole was denied the ability to remove additional cave murals abroad or any artifact abroad because of westernized Chinese scholars in Beijing. That's the real reason. This is why it's so complex here. Now, the takeaway message, we always want to have a big takeaway message here. The takeaway message is that the Second Fog Expedition in 1925 is basically your Chinese equivalent to the obstruction of the Egyptians of Howard Carter at Tutankhamun's tomb in 1924 in Egypt. The details, of course, are very different, but the big picture is the same. With all three of the key elements in place: westernized domestic elites, national museum, antiquities, preservation laws. With all three elements in place, obstruction occurs when domestic mirror images of the Western archaeologists, men like Chen Wanli, find themselves at the same site at the same time as Westerners. And both of them want to treat it like white men would. Then conflict is inevitable. Okay. Now let's move on to the Sino-Swedish expedition. I love this slide. Sven Hedin, what a promoter. Very much like Roy Chapman Andrews, always looking for an extra buck by selling his likeness to various commercial products and whatnot, writing sensationalist accounts of his marvelous travels around the world. This, I believe, is a advertisement for beef or meat extract or meat sauce. Ridiculous. Yes, that has a lot to do with all of his expeditions around the world. I always made sure I took a jar of this wonderful meat sauce. So for dinner every single night. All right. So Sven Hedin, it's been a while. He was actually did some of the earliest expeditions in northwestern China, way back in the 1890s. He was actually the first one to show that it was possible to venture into the Taklamakan Desert for weeks at a time in the winter, taking frozen blocks of ice with you and then melting the ice for water. And he showed that it was possible for men like Stein to later come in and do proper excavations. Hedin generally didn't excavate and generally didn't take stuff away from China. Generally, there's some exceptions, but generally he's not excavating and removing artifacts like all the other guys are. So he is seen in a somewhat different light, and his agenda this time is also different. He doesn't come saying, I want to do necessarily archaeology and remove stuff. He has a very interesting agenda. His original plan was very subversive. I remember all that stuff about espionage, the historical Indiana Jones always carrying out espionage and whatnot. His original plan was he was being funded by Lufthansa to chart potential airstrips and refueling depots for a trans-Eurasian Lufthansa air route. It's a commercial venture. Okay? And he tells the warlord in Beijing, Jiang Zolin, this is still the warlord era, this is 1927, We're having the rise of Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist government in the south, but they haven't yet actually established their new capital. In 1927, Hedin goes to the warlord of Beijing. He's the warlord, actually, of the entire Northeast, Manchuria as well. The Japanese will bomb his train and kill him in 1928. He tells him, we want to do aerial archaeology. Sounds like a lofty scientific endeavor, right? Zhang Zuolin couldn't care less what Sven Hedin's pretext is going to be for what he wants to do. He's a warlord, he's a politician. Okay? Zhang Zuolin is eager to oblige him. Why? Because he can get diplomatic and economic capital, to be sure, but he can also, this will also allow warlord Zhang Zuolin, this will allow him to assert his political authority in the domains of rival warlords. Zhang Zuolin's in Beijing. He's just taken the national capital. He has great ambitions. How do I further cement my position as the presumptive leader of China? Well, I need to start exerting my power in rival warlord domains of China. Gansu province is not controlled by Zhang Zuolin. If I sponsor what supposedly is a scientific mission of aerial archaeology, no one who wants to be considered modern can disagree with that. So I'll have a wonderful pretext to send foreigners through rival jurisdictions of other warlords on a scientific pretext, and meanwhile be sort of subtly imposing my authority on rival warlords. You have to respect the papers, the passport that I issued for these guys in Beijing. Right? This is how the warlord era, the Civil War, and the Japanese invasion in the 1930s and 1940s will continue to undermine the new order in China. Okay? But the big difference now is people like this. Fully westernized Chinese scholars in prominent Western-style institutions. The National Palace Museum, formerly the Forbidden City, Peking University, these sorts of things. All right, look at them. They're dressed exactly like Westerners dress in this sort of a context. All right, these guys are fully Westernized in their education, in their mindset, in their ideology. And because of that, they're going to say, we're going to do like you guys do. These things are priceless emblems of the nations that they represent, and they have to stay within the boundaries of the state that represents that nation. And that's China. And we're just as qualified as you to take care of it. We have the institutions and laws in place. So there's no reason anymore why you should be doing this work and taking things abroad. That's theft. That's now considered theft. After the second fog expedition, these guys come to realize their true power. And they realize we can compel Chinese officials who are in pursuit of diplomatic, political, economic capital. We can compel them to do the right thing, either voluntarily by telling them, hey, this is what we should be doing. This is what, if you want to be considered modern, you should be doing this. Conform with scientific ideals. Or if they don't do it voluntarily, we can shame you into doing it. We can shame you into it by giving you bad media attention. So these guys put together a more formal organization. The first one that Hedin encounters is called the Association of Chinese Scholarly Organizations. This will eventually morph within a year or two to the much more famous Commission for the Preservation of Antiquities. And this is from the famous statement that they put out about Stein's expedition in 1930, trying to get him kicked out of Xinjiang. The National Commission for the Preservation of Antiquities, it begins as the Association of Chinese Scholarly Organizations. When these guys learn of Sven Hedin's deal with Zhang to allow him to do an expedition of so-called aerial archaeology, how did they get Zhang to change the terms? Not willingly. Zhang isn't willing to do it. He says, hey, I'm getting my political capital out of this. I'm ingratiating myself with German industrialists, and I'm also imposing my authority on rival warlord domains. I'm not going to stop this. I'm getting a lot out of this. It's harmless archaeology. Who cares? He's a politician. So what does the Association of Chinese Scholarly Organizations do? Bad media publicity. They'll do the same thing with Roy Chapman Andrews. They'll do the same thing with Oral Stein. This is the last resort of westernized domestic elites who find that their political leaders are more interested in engaging the old forms of the compensations of cooperation. What's our last method of doing battle? Bad media attention. tarnishing their ability to represent themselves as the protector of the Chinese nation because they're not protecting near ancient antiquities, the things that represent this nation. Hedin's quote illustrates this when he later writes about this. He says, quote, "We were afraid of being overthrown by this government, which sought popularity with the nationalistic mob, with its hoarse yell, 'Crucify, crucify.'" Oh, he's so dramatic. We're about to be crucified on the cross. Give me a break. These guys are so dramatic. But what he's saying here is essentially the same thing. The government had to respond. They sought popularity with the nationalistic mob. That's a pejorative way of saying the Association of Chinese Scholarly Organizations gave us bad publicity, gave Jiang Zuolin bad publicity, and then he felt compelled to clamp down on us and give in to the demands of westernized Chinese scholars, or else his legitimacy as the presumptive ruler of all of China is going to be tarnished. Note the parallels to the obstruction of Howard Carter at the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1924 when we looked at Howard Carter's diary. Howard Carter's unpublished diary revealed that some of the Egyptian politicians that actually were opposing him and clamping down on the guest list and who has access to Tut's tomb, some of those Egyptian politicians seem to be taking a hard line, largely because the Egyptian press had started to shame them publicly as well. That is to say, some of the Egyptian officials, even in a country that isn't riven by civil war, like China is at this time period, were also still happy to engage the compensations of cooperation. And then Egyptian press filled with westernized Egyptian educated people, journalists. They're the ones who start saying, this is not okay. How do we get our leaders to do the right thing? We can have our leaders do the right thing. There's my phone. Do the right thing by shaming them in the national Egyptian press. T-Mobile. And that's exactly what they do. And that's when they start to clamp down even harsher on who has access to Tut's tomb. Now, Hedin will, as a result of this, be forced to submit to a host of new concessions in 19 separate clauses because Jiang Zuolin gives in. Says, I don't want this bad media attention at a critical moment in my career. When Chiang Kai-shek is starting to establish a rival government in the South, I need positive media attention as a legitimate nationalist politician. So what are the new concessions? The most important one for Hedin is that he can't remove anything. You can't take anything out of the country. We know this isn't just for air routes. You're also going to take stuff away. You know it. This is a big team you brought with you. Not only can you not remove anything, not only are your maps going to have to be limited to a certain scale, because we know you also map stuff too, you spy. It says an equal number of Chinese and foreign scholars must be composed in this expedition. This can't just be like last time. 6 or 7 Americans and 1 Chinese, Chen Wanli. No. We're going to have the same numbers. This is going to be half and half. And I think it ends up being something like 10 and 10 or something like that. Okay. And also, you can't call this an expedition. You can't call this an expedition. You need to rebrand it as a scientific survey. Why? Because an expedition has the undertone of a barbarian land, an uncivilized land. Expeditions, as we'll see in the conclusion with that, or we've seen before, with that David Huffine cartoon in the Saturday Evening Post from 1937, expeditions were what civilized people, white people, did in uncivilized, dark-skinned lands. And the Chinese are acutely aware of the insulting undertones of a word like expedition. So when you come to China and you do work like this, archaeological work, that's not an expedition, because we're not an uncivilized land. See, now they are very sensitive to this because they're also westernized. We're just as civilized as you. So stop using pejorative words. It's a scientific survey because we're scientists. And so are you. And no one's doing an expedition in China anymore. You only do scientific surveys. All right. Why does Hedin agree to this? Because he does agree, and it's going to set a very important precedent. Hedin agrees probably because he's not really that much of an excavator. He wasn't really planning to remove a ton. He probably would have still collected some stuff, but that wasn't his main mission. His main mission was commercial, to please his Lufthansa sponsors. He wanted to chart the land and negotiate with warlords for air route permissions and potential places to have refueling depots, because this is the old days, and you didn't have a Boeing 747 that could fly, 12 hours all at once. They would have to have multiple stations along the way through northwestern China. The effect, however, of his concession, of his submission, will be huge. It's going to be huge. It's going to set a new precedent that the westernized Chinese of Beijing will invoke with all later expeditions. Well, Hedin agreed. Why shouldn't you? Hedin's a major Western scholar who's done expeditions before. He repented. He decided to work with us. He thought we were worthy of working with. So why shouldn't you have to follow the Hedin precedent? We talk about the Tut effect. We can also talk about the Hedin effect, because it's going to have the exact same influence. Now, the reality we know is different. At the end of the expedition, as we read here, Hedin will actually be rewarded with a Tibetan temple that he reconstructs in America and other antiquities. And criticism of him that was levied by the Chinese archaeologist Huang Wenbi will be suppressed. All right, so the reality will be a little bit different, because once you've conformed to Chinese demands and you allow them to present themselves as the ones who are calling the shots and are the ones doing the scientific expedition, and you're not insulting them anymore by imposing your will on them and doing what you want and removing things from the country, they're still happy to make some concessions behind the scenes, but those concessions can't be public. They have to be in private. All right. Now, Hedin's capitulation will be deemed so important that not only does he get official Chinese sponsorship of the expedition, later on we'll see he gets kicked out of Xinjiang by the warlord Jin Shuren, goes back to Nanjing, where Chiang Kai-shek's government has now actually risen to power and set a new national capital in Nanjing. And they'll even say, hey, you're going back again. We're going to sponsor you because we like this joint expedition showing that Chinese and Westerners are equal in their modern scientific qualifications. And we also want to impose our authority on a distant warlord who's not under our control. So they allow him to issue official Chinese government stamps. And in the Latin, they still managed to sneak in an expedition in here. But the Chinese is very clear. Xibei Kexue Kaocha Tuan Jinian, in commemoration of the Northwest Scientific Survey. Right? Scientific survey. It can't be an expedition unless you sneak it in Latin, I guess. So his capitulation is not only so important and symbolic that he gets official Chinese sponsorship with stamps, but he also gets molded into the image of a penitent imperialist. I had to use the word penitent because it's such a iconic word from the third Indiana Jones. Only the penitent man will pass. They mold him into the image of a penitent imperialist. I'm sorry for what we did in the past. Things will be different now. We regard you as equals, and going forth, we will always work together, and I'll abide by the terms that you set. Okay? That image will be very important. That all sets a precedent for anyone else who's going to come in Hedin's wake. Now, the tensions we talked about, however, reality versus the ideal, we see this in the diaries of Huang Wenbi and Xu Shusheng, members of the expedition. Here we have some of the photographs. There's Xu Shusheng on the right. There's another one of those that I really wanted to put into the book, but we didn't have space for. Now you do know what Xu Shusheng actually looks like. It's interesting to compare the diaries of Huang and Xu because they give us very different views of how the expedition is proceeding. How does Xu talk about his foreign colleagues in general and Hedin in particular as exemplars of scientific modernity that recognize the errors of their past ways and are eager to cooperate with Chinese counterparts as their full equals now? To Xu, Hedin is infallible. Any tensions on the expedition trail are ascribed to other German and Swedish and Dutch members of the expedition, not Hedin. Hedin's perfect. Okay? The way that I talked about this in the chapter is that Xu saw the expedition as he wanted it to be, whereas Huang Wenbi in his diary saw it as it actually was. And that's why one diary was published and one was not. Xu's diary will be published in Chinese, I believe, in 1930. Huang Wenbi's diary will never be published in his entire lifetime. It only gets published by his children in the 1990s, I believe. And so Huang's diary is very uncensored. Xu's diary, you have to assume he's massaged a lot because he wants to uphold the image of a penitent imperialist correcting the error of his past ways and now working with the Chinese. This is the new order, recognizing the Chinese are his equal and respecting Chinese laws. This is why Hedin's diary will be allowed to be published. It serves the political agenda of the 1920s and the 1930s. Huang Wenbi's incessant criticisms of Hedin the fact that he calls out all the duplicity, the reality that Hedin is not actually abiding by those 19 clauses, that's going to lead to his diary not being published, because it's not in the interest of the political authorities to have Hedin criticized. It's much more important to have the image of a penitent imperialist working with the Chinese. That's much more important. How does Huang Wenbi talk about his foreign colleagues? Very hard to find a photograph of Huang Wenbi. I had one that's a good one, but it's when he's very old. He's like in his 60s or something. And that's not what he would have been age here. Here's another photo. You can't really see him all that well. Yuan Fuli's on this expedition as well, by the way. Anyway, so here's a blurry picture of Huang Wenbi at the time when this is actually a photograph from the expedition as well. Huang, he doesn't spare anyone. His criticism, he is very much saying, I am going to uphold the ideals of the new scientific order. I'm a fully westernized Chinese. He's not thinking of himself in that way, but he's subscribing to Western ideals. Everything stays in China. Anyone who doesn't conform to Chinese laws is a thief. And Hedin is, in his mind, someone who is breaking all the laws that he said he would uphold, and is still insulting towards the Chinese. And we know all these tensions come out in his diary. And I compare this in this chapter, the way that Xu and Huang will talk about the exact same event very differently. We don't have to go into it again because the details are in the chapter. Make sure you pay attention to that closely. But you have their different reactions to the flower and drum opera troupe, their different reactions to a camel thief, their different reactions to whether or not the Huang should be allowed to go look for a rumored site of the Great Wall, part of the Great Wall from the Qin dynasty, from the 3rd century BC. And then there are different reactions to the fact that Hedin is being led through sensitive strategic military sites when they get to Xinjiang. He's not happy about that either. Note all of these different things that Huang and Xu, there are different ways that they look at this. In general, Xu is constantly trying to smooth over it, to whitewash it, omit it, say that Hedin is right, and I agree with him, and he's not breaking any laws or insulting the Chinese. Whereas Huang is saying, are you kidding me? He's breaking our laws. He's disrespecting us. He doesn't want us to get credit. And he's still insulting the Chinese nation. They're taking, film of the camel thief in chains. They're imposing their own form of law and punishment on Chinese territory. This is the old imperialist of the old days. It just looks different on paper, but that's it. But to the political authorities in Nanjing, looking good on paper is all they need. That serves their political agenda, and Huang is going to be shut up as a result of that. Let's keep the appearances looking good on paper. Hedin is far more valuable to us in the ideal than he is in the reality. What are the reactions of the Chinese governors in Xinjiang when the Sino-Swedish expedition gets there? Hey, there's Yang Zhenxin. We remember him. He's still in power. This is a fascinating guy. It'd be great to be able to write a biography of him in English. Yang Zhenxin's been in power for 17 years when the Sino-Swedish expedition arrives in 1928. And he's no nonsense. He sees right through it. He says, there's no way in hell you're going to be carrying out any of those surveys of potential refueling depots, landing strips, all that. He says, no way. Not going to happen. You can do some true scientific archaeological work, sure. But anything related to landing strips and refueling depots, get out of here. And they do. Some of them start to say, okay, the Germans, some of the Germans who came along and are more closely associated with the Lufthansa agenda, they start to leave. And you see Huang in his diary saying, the shrill cry of the Germans is not enough to intimidate my countrymen. He's very proud of Yang's reaction. And then everything, the shit hits the fan. And everything goes to hell. This is a wonderful photograph. I found this a couple years ago in the Royal Society of Asian Affairs in London. I was just going there at the last minute. I was like, I don't think they're going to have much on my topic of research, but you got to cover all your bases. I don't want someone to accuse me of not having gone to all the archives I should have gone to. So I went, and there in the files of Colonel Reginald Schomburg, a British intelligence agent who sold weapons to Governor Jean Shuren in the late 1920s and traveled through the province, was this photograph, which I've never seen before. Do you have any idea how precious this photograph is? This is, if you read the Chinese caption up here, look at the date. 中华民国17年7月7日, July 7th, 1928, known as the triple coup day, triple seven coup, the 7th day of the 17th month of the 17th year of the Republic. 1928 is the 17th year of the Republic that was begun in 1911. Doesn't quite work perfectly, 17, but it's still a 7. So it's called the 777 coup. This photograph, I can't believe this actually exists. This is the graduation ceremony photograph at the Russian School of Law and Language in Urumqi. Right after this photograph was taken, they go to lunch. They stand up for a toast, and the waiters pull out guns and blow Yang Zhenxing away. And then Jin Shuren becomes governor. Jin Shuren was much more hostile to the expedition. He's a warlord. He has no ties to Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government whatsoever. How does he see the expedition? With some justification, he sees them as the extension of rival warlords and possibly the source of Governor Yang's assassination. How does he know what role they might have played? Oh, this group of foreigners and westernized Chinese scholars, radical reformists from Beijing, the domain of a rival warlord, Zhang Zuolin, issued their papers. They show up, and miraculously, Yang Zhenxing is assassinated. Now, today we know they had nothing to do with it, probably. But you can understand that's a rational, reasonable reaction by Governor Jin. He says, "You guys are getting the hell out of here. First of all, you come in wanting to have airstrips and refueling depots. Yang says no, and then he's assassinated. Get the hell out of my province. For all I know, you're going to orchestrate my assassination as well." Why is Jin unable to fully obstruct the expedition? He has some temporary success, but ultimately he fails. Because once Hedin and Shu are kicked out of the province, they go back to Nanjing, and they find out that newly risen Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government, nationalist with the capital N, in Nanjing, is eager to extend its authority throughout all of China. All warlords who are not part of the nationalist domain, they say, hey, we're going to find a way to chip away at your autonomy. And this is a great way of chipping away at Governor Jin's autonomy. Say, we're going to send this expedition back into Xinjiang, and we're going to force you to accept the diplomatic papers from the new government in Nanjing. It's a symbolic chipping away of Jin Shuren's authority. It's not substantive, but it's something. It's a start. It's a start. And how are they going to overcome Jin Shuren's objections? Jin's going to throw the kitchen sink, everything he has at him, saying, oh, these are, you think this is scientific expedition? They're actually still imperialists. The Swedes and whatnot, these are foreign imperialists. They're still mapping our land. And the Chinese who you sent here, they're radical reformists who are totally under the thumb of the foreigners. And all of them are destabilizing the province. Every single time, the Nanjing government comes back and says, sorry, this is a joint scientific endeavor with legitimate, fully qualified scientific Chinese scholars who have equal power with the expedition. Xu Shusheng is a co-leader with Sven Hedin. It's not Sven Hedin and then Xu Shusheng. It's Xu and Hedin together as co-leaders. And an equal number of Chinese, all of them fully qualified with a Western education. This is legitimate. They don't really care if it's legitimate as far as the scholarly results, but they do care that it gives them the credentials to overcome Jin's objections that it's not about science. This is really political espionage. So what's Jin's only remaining trump card? He says, oh, okay, their scientific practices of archaeology are instigating a rebellion against the ignorant Muslims because they're digging up skulls and fondling skulls and whatnot, and this is unbearable. It's the custom of our people to keep skulls buried in the ground. I love that quote. So he's going to say, hey, you're going to instigate a race war, and the Uyghurs are going to rise up because these, Chinese and foreign scientists don't respect traditional customs of burial. Right? You want to lose Xinjiang province due to a race war? Then go right ahead. Nanjing's response? Sorry, if the ignorant Muslims are going to rise up for a legitimate scientific research project involving legitimate Chinese scholars who have control over the expedition and its agenda and are doing real scientific work, then it's your job to enlighten the masses, not to join their vulgar, ignorant chorus of criticism. You get out there and you do your job and you tell your subjects that this is science and this is for the glory and betterment of China. And don't just echo their ignorant, superstitious criticisms. And with that, The Sino-Swedish expedition continues for many more years with the full blessing of the new nationalist central government in Nanjing and sets the precedent. Now it's enshrined. Any foreigners who come to China, this is the precedent. This is how things are now. Because we have the rise of the apprentices. They're no longer apprentices anymore. They've gone from the apprentice of Chen Wanli. They've gone from nothing on Warner's first expedition and all previous expeditions to one guy, Chen Wanli, attached to an expedition as an apprentice, to fully fledged co-leaders and equal colleagues. And foreigners can still come. We'll welcome you. Because it's we're all for international scientific collaboration, but we set the rules now. And the rules say you can't break our laws, you can't take anything out of our country, because they're now priceless emblems of the Chinese nation, and we have the institutions, the laws, everything to back that up. So our final chapter is we're going to see the few foreigners who said, to hell with that, come on, it's still the Chinese, come on, I'll get my way. I have money, I have guns, I have friends in high places. Don't worry about these guys. Hedin was from a small, tiny country. That's why he couldn't resist. Just wait. When we get people coming back with American sponsorship, America flexing its muscles in the interwar era, don't worry about it. Well, we'll see what happens in chapter 6. Foreign devils be gone. All right, everyone, take care and see you then.